So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker today. The session is on rights and responsibilities, understanding an employer's role in supporting employee mental health in the new normal, ensuring company policies provide for mental health difficulties, examining legislation around mental health disability discrimination, and reasonable adjustments, simple provisions to support staff mental well-being. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Francoise Woolley, Head of Mental Health and Wellbeing at ACAS. Over to you, Francoise.
Many thanks, Adrian, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully you can see my slides. So as Adrian said, my name is Francoise Woolley and I'm Head of Mental Health and Wellbeing at ACAS. ACAS, the Advisory Conciliation Arbitration Service, I'm sure many of you have come across. We are an independent public body who is funded by the government, and we work with millions of employees, employers a year, really just to focus on improving workplace relations and improving productivity. So you may have come across our helpline where we give advice around all sorts of types of employment law and good practice. Perhaps you've had a senior advisor come into your workplace, advise you around all sorts of issues, including we're doing a lot at the moment around advising organisations on health and wellbeing strategies. You may have come across an individual conciliator who has helped resolve a dispute with an employee before it's gone to employment tribunal. So I've been asked today to talk about rights and responsibilities in the new normal. So what does that look like? Well, it's useful to have a think about where we've been really in the last year. These are some pictures that you may well relate to. I can certainly relate to that top left one, having homeschooled 2 children throughout lockdown periods, 2 small children. And really that was the biggest test to my resilience, I have to say. And then we've got the picture on the right hand side, which is the kind of Zoom and Teams world that we've got ourselves into. I think the woman is very happy and smiling in that picture, and perhaps this was at the beginning of lockdown. But what we're finding now is obviously people are having a lot of Zoom fatigue. And that is impacting people's mental health and well-being as well. And then the last picture we've got is somebody who, you know, recognising the huge amount of people that have still been working on the front line and dealing with those stressors on a day-to-day basis. Where are we now? Well, essentially what organisations are doing now are preparing for going back to work. So the anxieties that we're certainly seeing and lots of calls coming into our helpline are really quite a lot of it is about the commute to work and the anxieties around health and safety there. But also then what will work look like? Work will be very different. The workplace will look different. Some people have, indeed we have in ACAS, we've recruited people who have never known going into the office. So there's lots of anxieties around that. So when we're talking about kind of what are our responsibilities, we look at mental health and well-being in a very holistic way. So we very much view, if you look at our framework here, and we devised this a couple of years ago, but it's still very relevant. In order to achieve positive well-being in the workplace, there has to be a shared goal between employers, between managers, and between the individuals, the staff. So we do often get phone calls and referrals around, can you come in and deliver training to our managers to make sure they can have those conversations, make sure they can spot the signs and symptoms of mental ill health. And that's really, really important work. But unless employers are looking at, you know, tackling the sources of stress, making sure that they are developing a culture where people can feel able to speak about their mental health, then the effects of that kind of training is diminished really. So it's really this kind of joined up approach that we look at. And of course, we've got the backdrop at the moment, which is everything else that's going on in the world of work. So I've put a link here. There was a lot of information in these slides. I just wanted you to have as much as you could really, but there's a link at the top there where you can click into our framework and find out a bit more information. But as I said, this is from an employer's point of view, it's very much around kind of embedding a wellbeing strategy, reducing stigma, tackling the causes, etc. So these are the three areas that I've been asked to talk about today. So ensuring company policies provide for mental health difficulties, having a look at the legislation, and also thinking about what kind of workplace adjustments you can put in place for staff. So let's start with the basics really. So in terms of policies, so policy is really important to have to show your commitment to mental health and well-being in the workplace, to show what are the roles and responsibilities of managers, of staff, of the organisation, to put across what sources of support there are for individuals. But it is very much, it's not just about the policy, it's the behaviours that lie underneath that. What is the culture of the organisation? What do senior leaders model in their behaviours and those kinds of things? I put this slide up here because I do think that people get very caught up in the language they have when they create a policy around this area. So whether it's health and well-being, stress management, mental health and well-being, don't worry too much about that. It is very much about what is the content that goes into those policies. So what is the content? Well, I've put some information here and there's more information on our website of the kind of things that you might want to include. So your commitment to promoting positive mental health. And really the second bit, it relates to Tony's point really, around creating psychological safety. So really how you are going to create an atmosphere where people feel able to talk openly about mental health. And we'll talk a bit later, and actually the further presentations today are going to go into more detail about how you do that. The requirement for staff to have training, recognition about what can impact people's mental health, and a bit more information here around kind of support services and expectations from individuals. So it might be support around employee assistance program, mental health first aiders, or external sources of support. So do go on our website and there's a bit more information to support you if you are looking at a policy there. The other thing to think about is if you are creating a policy, which we recommend you do, is have a look at all of your other policies, because although they may not be directly about health and well-being, there will be elements related to mental health and well-being in them. And what you want to do is to be able to refer to your policy, your mental health and well-being policy within those. We are finding a lot of organisations now are reviewing or even creating and updating their home working policies. And it's really important that when you do that, that you really have a heavy emphasis on mental health and well-being as part of that policy. So how are you encouraging, for example, managers to have regular conversations with their staff so staff feel connected to the workplace? How are you ensuring you put across the importance of taking regular breaks and looking after yourself? How are you making sure that that it's fair that those that are home working are getting the same opportunities that those are coming into the office? So really important at the moment as we look into home working, smarter working, going into the future. Some questions if you want to sort of go down this route really to think about your policies and procedures that might kind of help you really incorporate mental health and well-being. So do your policies, procedures discriminate against people with mental health conditions? Are they supportive of those with pre-existing health conditions, or will they exacerbate or trigger these? Will it put staff under additional stress? Does it include information on the different support pathways available? So just thinking as an example, for example, a discipline and grievance policy, we know that the statutory right for a disciplinary is for a formal process for someone to be able to take in a work colleague or a trade union representative. Now, a reasonable adjustment for someone with a mental health condition is you might extend that. So you could extend that to a mental health advocate or even a family member. So it's just thinking about those kind of things. I did work with an organisation a couple of years ago, and they did have a policy around parking spaces. Parking spaces were only available for senior managers, and you can probably imagine how that went down with the trade unions as well. But when it really came to light was that it was an individual, a more junior member of staff, who was diagnosed with agoraphobia, and one of the symptoms, the main symptoms, was that fear of open spaces, and they wanted to use a parking space as a reasonable adjustment to support them in their kind of, you know, coming to work really, and it was rejected because of this policy. So a really sort of clear example of, you know, does it support individuals with mental health conditions? As I said before, it's not just about policy, it's about what you do, and it's about your strategy in supporting mental health in the workplace. Tony, I'm envious of his slide because he had a pretty picture of it, but he had the health and wellbeing at work survey figures up there, and this is the most recent one that's just come out. Interestingly, Tony put that, you know, half organisations have a formal strategy. I've gone the other way, and I've said nearly half organisations still lack a formal strategy or approach, and tend to act on an ad hoc basis. And that's what's happened. You know, we got thrown into this pandemic, and we were doing what we can to support our staff and make sure that we could run business as usual. But having said that, you know, there has been a fall in the proportion of those who report their organisation as much more reactive than proactive. Okay, so a substantial increase in the proportion of organisations taking a proactive approach. And those are some examples there, using staff surveys, focus groups, stress risk assessments, and audits and training and stuff. So that is definitely good news, that people are taking a more proactive approach. And this is so important, really. And I think, you know, traditionally in the past, organisations, in my experience, have relied on employee assistance programmes, on their mental health first aiders. But we know that that is reactive. That is really what has happened where things have got to a difficult point. So that's a really bad sentence. So things have got very difficult. But how are you being more proactive? How are you taking mental health and well-being into every decision that you are making as an organisation, into business as usual? And that's really what we mean by a strategy. So, and it's thinking about the things that are coming up. So certainly internally with ACAS, I'm currently with my team doing a lot of work around supporting staff going back to work. So how are we supporting managers? Or we're putting on line manager clinics so they can share experiences. We're putting on training to support managers to support their staff. We're putting on talk sessions for all staff to kind of share their experiences. And we've got localised task groups for when people go back to work. They can be supported by these task groups. They can address their needs. You know, and part of these task groups, we've got mental health first aiders and health and wellbeing champions as well. So really important to think about your strategy and what's coming up as well. Just keeping an eye on time. So just having a look at the law now. So there are three areas in law which are really important for us to think about. So the first one is the Health and Safety at Work Act. So every employer has a duty to ensure that their health and safety and welfare of employees is protected. And that includes mental and physical health. And I think traditionally, you know, we've been better around the physical health element, but now it's really coming to the forefront, mental health and how we need to do risk assessments and support mental health. In common law, there's a duty of care to all staff, and organisations should take all reasonable steps to ensure the health and safety and well-being of their staff. So that really relates to if in law it's called psychiatric harm. So if mental ill health is foreseeable, then an employer could be held liable. And then lastly, the Equality Act. So the Equality Act protects, has lots of protected characteristics which you must not treat people unfairly on the basis of those. And one of them is disability. And I'll talk a bit more about the definition of disability, but mental health can come under that. So we mustn't treat people unfairly because they have a mental health condition. And it requires employees to provide reasonable adjustments so that an employee is not disadvantaged due to their disability. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So just having a think about the definition of disability. So a disabled person is defined as someone who has a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out their day-to-day activities. So a bit of a mouthful, but let's sort of break that down. So we're talking about a physical or mental health impairment, and that is fairly self-explanatory. It doesn't, what the law looks at, it doesn't look at the diagnosis, it more looks at the impact that it has on a person's ability to do their day-to-day activities. That's the sort of starting point, and then it would look back at sort of diagnosis and symptoms and things. So in terms of adverse impact on someone's ability to do their day-to-day activities, that could be a wide range of things: reading, writing, shopping, dressing oneself, ability to concentrate, focus, form social relationships, and those kinds of things. Is it substantial? Well, this is, when organisations are looking at this, this is a very low threshold actually, because in employment law, substantial is more than minor or trivial. So it's quite a low standard. And some guidance recently in employment law has, we've had a bit more guidance from cases, and it should focus on what employees cannot do or can only do with a lot of difficulty, okay? Not what they can do easily. And then the last point is substantial is the substantial effect long term. So in law, this is 12 months or more, or likely to be 12 months or more. Now, we know that some conditions come in episodes. So depression, for example, we might be up and down with depression. So really, the 12 months doesn't have to be 12 months in one period. It can be fluctuations. And I think something that organisations don't always take into account, in my experience, is someone receiving treatment for their mental health condition. Because what the law looks at is what would be the impact if they weren't receiving treatment, okay? It's just something to be aware of, really. So I just want to go through a couple of employment law, sort of some case law really, to put some of this into context. My son loved this slide when he saw it, a great picture of a fire engine. So this is all about, you know, a reminder really of the need to consider reasonable adjustments, okay? So just to read out the states of the facts of the case. So Mr. Hull was a fire station manager for the London Fire Brigade, and he applied for an urgent transfer to a station closer to his home, and he cited personal circumstances that were causing him much distress, and he included his daughter's mental health issues. He was diagnosed with depression, and he was prescribed medication, and he was referred to occupational health. He did go off sick, and Mr. Hull requested some reasonable adjustments, okay? So some adjustments when we're talking about that to help ensure individuals are not at a substantial disadvantage, okay? And his reasonable adjustments were a phased return to work, and also included a transfer to a station closer. And the occupational health report actually supported all of this as well. And he'd heard of a post that came up at somewhere nearer, fire station nearer, and the transfer needed to be requested by someone senior. Now, this individual did not support the transfer, and the reason that they cited this was that because Mr. Hull was still in development, and it was the policy of the employer not to transfer an employee still in development, then he could not be transferred. So remember what I was saying about, do our policies discriminate against those with mental health difficulties? And clearly there was an issue here. He was also invited to a disciplinary hearing and asked to admit to the offence of having an unacceptable record of attendance, so 104 working days out of 140. So he brought a claim of discrimination and a failure to make those reasonable adjustments so that he was not at a disadvantage because of his disability. And he won his case. So they did find, the Employment Tribunal found that there was a failure to put in place reasonable adjustments. And they also found that it was inappropriate that his absence was talked about as an offence, okay? And it wasn't a justifiable reason to be dismissed, okay? So just a word of warning to think about what are the adjustments that can support someone to stay in work. Another piece of case law here. So does an employer have constructive knowledge of a disability if the employee hides their disability? Now, what do we mean by constructive knowledge? So constructive knowledge is where an employer could reasonably have been expected to know that a person was disabled. Okay, so the facts of this case are Mrs. Z was disabled. She had schizophrenia, and she didn't tell her employer about her disability and was dismissed for poor attendance and timekeeping. So she took her employer to Employment Tribunal and claimed unfair dismissal and discrimination. Now, the Employment Tribunal found that given the kind of evidence and the clues that were there, that they did have constructive knowledge. They should have probed a bit more. But this then went to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, who actually said that even if more inquiries were have been made, Mrs. Z made so much efforts to mask her mental health condition that actually they still wouldn't have had constructive knowledge. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because I do find with organisations there is this fear of if we dismiss someone and then they come back and say, I have a disability. But could they have had constructive knowledge? But there's a caveat here, because you need to obviously do all you can do to ensure that you look into why somebody is not performing, why somebody is turning up late, and give them the opportunities to tell you that they may be suffering from a disability or a mental health condition. Okay. So looking at workplace adjustments. So just a reminder, so a workplace adjustment is a change or adjustment unique to a person's need that will enable them to do their job. And in employment law, we talk about reasonable adjustments, okay? So what is reasonable? And it's this question that is used in employment law a lot, and I know people find it difficult. Well, ultimately, it's for an employment tribunal to decide. But does the adjustment remove or reduce the disadvantage that a person has as a result of their disability? Is it practical to make? Do you have the resources? Is it afforded by the organisation? Could it harm the health and safety of others if you put this adjustment in place? Those are the sorts of things. And I do always say, why would you not put the adjustment in place? Why would you not think about it to make sure that you support a good employee to stay in work? But it's really important, obviously, to think about, I'm talking to you about employment law. You may have someone who is suffering with their mental health and it doesn't meet that specific criteria. Now, we talk about good practice. So if somebody is suffering with their mental health, if somebody is suffering at work, we do what we can to support that person in work. I just want to show you, again, I've got a link to this at the bottom, but some research that we commissioned Affinity Health at Work to do around workplace adjustments. And it's really interesting because actually the evidence base is very small in terms of how effective reasonable adjustments are, workplace adjustments are. And that's not to say that they're not effective, it's just there isn't a lot of evidence to actually look at them over time and look at how effective they are. But what we found here is that it's the multi-component interventions are successful. So where you have a work adjustment mixed with something like cognitive behavioural therapy outside of work. We know that encouraging disclosure allows individuals more likely to talk about their mental health conditions and access workplace adjustments. And that goes back to what Tony was saying about really that kind of creating psychological safety. Support from supervisors, managers, co-workers, we know is also allows people to feel safe and able to access adjustments. And interesting, looking at the evidence, that HR tend to focus more on the work aspects, the job modifications, whereas if you speak to employees who are impacted, they focus on the relation aspects, support, good relationships and fair treatment. So it's also, again, Tony talks about taking a very individualized approach. So what adjustment might work for one person with depression, for example, might not work for another, because their symptoms may differ, their well-being may differ depending on how they are experiencing their condition. So as I said before, it's not just about that rigid kind of disability definition. We really encourage you in ACAS to think about what you can be doing to support those that are showing signs that they are having difficulties. Just putting a case study up here. So here we've got Laura. Laura has been working from home since the pandemic began. She's due to return to work at the beginning of July, and she's really anxious about her commute. She won't be fully vaccinated by then, and she's also anxious about returning to a busy environment after extended periods of isolation. Now, this is really something that we are seeing an awful lot from our calls to helpline, from the work our senior advisors are doing around sort of helping individuals and helping organisations rather. It is so obvious, but we always talk about communication in ACAS. So the biggest issue we see is lack of communication, and that can cause lots of problems. So speaking to Laura and finding out more about what is underlying these concerns, listening with empathy and trying to understand the concerns so we can look at how we can support Laura. Could she change her hours so that she avoids that busy commute? Is there anything we can say about the health and safety of the workplace which can alleviate some of her fears? Maybe she's picturing things quite differently to what it's actually going to look like. Where can she go to for support? So mental health first aider, health and wellbeing champion, EAP. And those are kind of regular check-ins in the lead up to and during that return to work period can all be really helpful for someone like Laura. So that's just a summary slide talking about some of those things that I've just talked to you about. Some ideas around reasonable adjustments. And then as I said, it's very much about taking an individual approach and talking to the individual, because often when we take an individual aside and we talk to them and we ask them what would help them, they will have ideas that we haven't thought about. So we don't have to be, managers don't have to be the experts. They will know what's worked for them in the past often. So it could be, as I say, flexible working hours to enable them to attend counselling appointments, for example, or to change their start and finish time, altering break times, adjusting targets, reallocating their duties, support from somebody at work, a buddy or a job coach, or working from another location. So it might be a reasonable adjustment for someone is working from home. It might be a reasonable adjustment that they work more in the office, actually, because of the social isolation. But we have to find out from that individual what will help them. And we won't, or we might need advice from occupational health, from for example, an expert advice, or from a GP to help with that, and consider what is reasonable, of course. So just a final sort of thoughts really in terms of supporting staff, and I know that further presentations are going to talk about this in a bit more detail. Being aware of those who have additional challenges, mental health conditions, for example. Look out for any changes in behaviour, but respond early on is very important. Asking about coping mechanisms, having purposeful conversations where you're giving people permission to talk about how they're coping. Signposting to significant support, confirm confidentiality boundaries where you are saying that actually, I may need to get advice from occupational health. Look at workplace reasonable adjustments, undertake a stress risk assessment, and the Health and Safety Executive have a lot of information to help you with that. And we do really recommend a wellness action plan. If you don't have one already, we signpost to that on our website, but mine do an excellent one. And it's all about looking at what impacts somebody's health and well-being what can you put in place, can they put in place, what are their triggers, etc. And that's brought me to the end. I'm sorry, Adrian, I might have gone over a little bit, but my details are up there, the details of our helpline, of our customer service team. If you want an advisor to come in, or you want training, please do contact us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francoise. An excellent presentation, much appreciated. We've got a few minutes left for questions. So there is one question in the chat, or in the Q&A section, which I will just read out to you. What can a workplace or employer do to ensure a good work-life balance for staff working from home, as it's easy for employees to feel they have to work outside of their contracted hours, as there is no one monitoring exactly what they're doing? And this is certainly something that I recognise from early on in the pandemic, back last March, April time, where it was very easy to suddenly think, oh, well, I can carry on working for another 2 or 3 hours in the evening, because you were in that mode, when actually you should have had a break and gone on and done other things that you would normally have done. Any tips around that, or any support you can give?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important because it's a pattern that we are seeing, definitely. You know, it started off with that kind of enjoying that work-life balance, the sound of the birds, all that kind of stuff. And now it's kind of like it's working longer hours, absolutely. And we can see people falling into that pattern. And there's lots of different things, really. I mean, you know, you said, Adrian, about, you know, we don't know what's happening with staff. It's harder with remote working, but actually we need to still know what is happening with staff. You know, line managers need to be having conversations with their staff around, how are you coping? You know, how are you managing your hours? And we need to think about the flexibility with this. Certainly, you know, when I was homeschooling, there was a period where actually I was really ineffective at work. I was really ineffective as a teacher as well, but I was really ineffective at work. But I could make up the time in the evenings, and that worked for me. So it's really having those individual conversations. What are you doing? What works for you? But what, you know, are our expectations? And I think I'm finding in organisations that some of this is coming down from the senior leaders. So senior leaders having back-to-back meetings, working very long hours, and not setting the best example, shall we say. So I think it does have to come from that, and senior leaders role modelling and setting the standard in terms of what is expected. You know, we know that people need exercise, people need breaks. That is going to cause issues for staff if they don't do that.
Wonderful, thank you. And a further sort of question to that, and what are your thoughts on having a workplace peer support group?
That sounds amazing. I think, you know, I like the sound of that. I'm going to explore that further for ACAS, actually. So a workplace support group. You know, we put sort of loads of things internally for support. The biggest thing I think we found when we put on, for example, line manager clinics or time to talk sessions for all staff, where they can talk about fairly freely, but sometimes we have themes around kind of how are you balancing work-life balance. The biggest thing that people have fed back on and what they've got out of that is actually that kind of social interaction with other people, but also knowing that they're not in the boat at the same, they're not in their own boat. You know, they are other people who are going through the same things as them. And that's been huge, actually, sort of bigger than I would have thought of in terms of the feedback for our staff. So I think that's an absolutely awesome idea, really. And I think when we talk about the three-pronged approach in terms of it's about managers, staff, but it's also about the employer. It's as an employer recognizing that. So recognizing that actually having those time for social interaction is really important for health and well-being. You know, we can't expect people to have back-to-back meetings. We need to support our staff. Happy staff are going to be more productive. So investing in things like that are obviously unbiased, but they're hugely important.
No, absolutely. And I think one of our attendees, Noor, has already set one up in their company. So you may want to have a chat with them offline and see how you can develop that. Because again, from an ACAS perspective, you can then show that different level of support throughout the organisations that you help support, and also others can demonstrate how to do it as well. Absolutely. One further question from me that is one of those tricky issues. And I'll go slightly into the comfort break. We won't go too far into it, but around reasonable adjustments, this is a big debate around what is reasonable. And when you're talking about sort of mental health frailties, people do have situations where they're not continuous. There are things that happen, perhaps they might just be once or twice a year. They're not something that you can always explain to people. And someone will say, oh, you look fine, there's no problem. They don't know what's going on behind in their personal life that makes things more complex. How do you best, from your perspective, explain those complex situations to line managers and people who have to manage the situation in a way that's inclusive and allowing that person to be authentic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, as a line manager, you don't have to be an expert in mental health to be able to support an individual and to think about what are the kind of things that might help them. And as I said before, you're not going to have all the answers. Often you might need to get some expert advice, or you might need to, you definitely need to speak to the individual who might have their own opinions. But I think you're right. So mental health conditions can fluctuate. And it's really important, and certainly we found this has been an issue that certainly when people, we were thrown into the pandemic and we were trying to cope as much as we could, but reasonable adjustments weren't being reviewed. So it's really important, when you have that individual conversation, that you review those workplace adjustments and you review, are they still working for you, reviewing them regularly. But I do think, going back to that, because I think managers, from my experience, are kind of quite fearful of those conversations, although they're getting more confident now with sort of training and stuff. But I do think, a tool like the Wellness Action Plan, it's really structured, and it does talk. It used to be a tool that we used in a clinical setting, but you can use it actually with all staff, not just someone who's suffering with their mental ill health. What keeps you healthy? What are the things that make you feel unwell at work? What can you do? What can we do? And it's that very individualized approach, but making sure that we review that.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. I don't think there are any other questions. So thank you very much for your presentation, Francoise. Much appreciated.